The most dangerous people in your life may never have been the most intelligent, and that's one of the most uncomfortable truths about human nature, because we've been taught to imagine the manipulator as a brilliant strategist, someone cold, calculating, almost impossible to perceive. But Carl Jung saw something much more disturbing. Often, those who manipulate don't act from superior intelligence. They act from internal wounds, fear, emotional needs, and unconscious parts of their own minds that have never been confronted. This completely changes how we understand power. Jung believed that human beings rarely truly know themselves. Most of what we feel, desire and fear, operates below consciousness. There is a hidden region within each person that he called the shadow. It's not just evil. It's everything we repress because it threatens the image we want to have of ourselves. Insecurity, envy, desire for control, need for approval, resentment, emotional fragility. The less someone recognizes their own shadow, the more it begins to silently control their actions. And it is precisely here that one of the most destructive forms of manipulation is born. Most people don't manipulate because they're geniuses. They manipulate because they can't cope with their own emotional emptiness. Some people don't know how to ask for love, so they create guilt. They don't know how to earn respect, so they create fear. They can't control themselves, so they try to control their environment. And the most unsettling thing is that many do this without fully realizing what they're doing. Jung observed that the unconscious always finds a way to express itself. If someone represses their anger, it reappears as victimhood. If they repress insecurity, it reappears as an obsessive need for control. If they repress feelings of inferiority, it can emerge as moral arrogance. The person believes they are merely reacting to the world, when in reality, they are being driven by internal forces they never understood. Meanwhile, intelligent people often fall into these traps precisely because they try to understand everything rationally. That's the paradox. The conscious mind seeks logic, coherence, clear explanations. But the unconscious doesn't work that way. The unconscious is emotional, contradictory, impulsive. And when someone emotionally disorganized clashes with someone highly rational, something curious happens. The rational person tries to organize the chaos. The chaotic person simply drags the other into it. That's why many intelligent people end up devastated in seemingly absurd relationships. They believe that if they analyze enough, they can solve the problem. But Jung warned about a fatal error of modern consciousness, believing that all human behavior stems from reason. It doesn't. Some people don't want to resolve conflicts. They want to alleviate internal pain by transferring the emotional burden to others. Others don't want to understand. They want to win emotionally. And there are those who transform suffering into identity, because they have discovered that pain can also generate power. The most dangerous thing is that manipulators rarely appear monstrous at first. Many seem fragile, misunderstood, sensitive, or morally upright. Jung understood this deeply. The shadow never presents itself using the face of darkness. It disguises itself as virtue, need, love, concern, or suffering. And perhaps that's exactly why so many people only realize they were being manipulated when they are already emotionally exhausted. But Jung believed there is an even more important question than how to identify manipulators. The real question is something else entirely. What is it within us that makes it possible for us to be manipulated? Because perhaps the greatest danger lies not in the darkness of other people. Perhaps it lies in the parts of our own minds that we have not yet learned to see. There is a dangerous idea that few intelligent people realize about themselves. The more self-awareness someone develops, the greater their vulnerability can become in the face of emotionally disorganized people. Carl Jung understood this deeply because he knew that emotional intelligence and rational intelligence are not the same thing. A person can understand philosophy, psychology, politics, and human behavior, but still be slowly destroyed by someone incapable of controlling their own impulses. And this happens more often than we imagine. Think about how many times someone has tried to resolve a difficult relationship using dialogue, patience, and understanding. Perhaps you've experienced this yourself. You notice strange signs, passive-aggressive comments, sudden mood swings, senseless accusations. Yet, instead of immediately walking away, you try to understand. You think, maybe this person is suffering. Maybe I misinterpreted things. Maybe there's something I'm not seeing yet. Jung believed that conscious people possess a dangerous tendency to project their own honesty onto others. This is one of the greatest psychological errors one can make. The balanced individual imagines that the other also desires balance. The sincere person believes that the other values sincerity. The ethical individual assumes that the other feels guilt when acting destructively. But not every mind works the same way, and when a highly rational person encounters someone ruled by their own shadow, the conflict becomes invisibly unequal. Because the rational person tries to understand, the unconscious person only reacts. While one seeks coherence, the other operates through unstable emotions, impulses, and a need for emotional control. Jung observed that what we repress within ourselves gains strength in the unconscious. Imagine someone who has spent their entire life hiding feelings of inferiority. Instead of acknowledging this pain, the person creates unconscious mechanisms to compensate for it. They may begin to control others emotionally. They may seek constant attention. They may create conflicts to feel important. They may transform any disagreement into a personal threat. The problem is that intelligent people usually interpret this behavior as something solvable. They believe that, with enough maturity, everything can be resolved. And that's exactly where they start to get lost. There's a silent pattern that plays out in many destructive relationships. One side is constantly trying to stabilize the emotional environment. The other is constantly disrupting it. One asks for clarity. The other creates confusion. One tries to build dialogue. The other transforms everything into emotional tension. Gradually, the conscious person begins to expend an absurd amount of energy trying to keep the relationship functioning, and often she doesn't even realize that she's already entered the other person's psychological game. Jung said that the unconscious has a frightening ability to capture the attention of consciousness. When someone who is emotionally unstable enters a constant crisis, the entire environment begins to revolve around that instability. Everyone starts reacting to that person's emotions. The focus ceases to be on truth. It ceases to be on balance. The focus becomes avoiding explosions, avoiding guilt, avoiding conflict. Perhaps you've seen this in families. A single emotionally chaotic person completely dominates the atmosphere of the house. Everyone learns to measure their words, control their reactions, and adapt their behavior to avoid tension. And the most striking thing is that, over time, this begins to seem normal. Jung understood that human beings possess a deep fear of psychological confrontation. Many people prefer to endure destructive relationships for years rather than admit that they were trying to save someone who didn't want to be saved, because there is something painful in accepting that not all suffering produces awareness. Not all pain produces maturity. Some people use their own pain as a tool of power, and perhaps that's one of the hardest truths to accept. Not every wounded person wants healing. Some want emotional control over those who try to help them. But there is something even more dangerous happening behind all of this. Because while the intelligent person tries to understand the other's behavior, an invisible force is growing within them without them realizing it. A mixture of guilt, emotional exhaustion, and psychological confusion that slowly begins to alter their own perception of reality. There is a specific moment when manipulation ceases to appear as a common conflict and begins to transform into psychological control. The problem is that almost no one notices this moment when it happens. Carl Jung believed that the human mind possesses a dangerous tendency. It tries to preserve emotional bonds even when these bonds begin to destroy its internal stability. And that is precisely why so many intelligent people remain too long in emotionally toxic environments. The beginning rarely seems threatening. Most of the time, it all starts with small emotional changes, a guilt-laden comment, an overreaction to something simple, an awkward silence used as emotional punishment. Then come sudden mood swings, indirect accusations, and conflicts that seem to arise out of nowhere. Gradually, you begin to feel the need to measure every word before speaking, and then something silent happens inside your mind. You stop acting naturally and begin to emotionally manage the other person. Jung understood this as a psychological invasion of consciousness. Your mental energy ceases to be focused on your own life and begins to revolve around the emotional state of the other person. But here's an uncomfortable question. Why do intelligent people remain in this cycle even when they see the signs? Because they believe that awareness solves chaos. That's the mistake. A rational mind imagines that conflicts can be resolved through conversation, understanding, and maturity. But emotional chaos doesn't seek solutions. It seeks absorption. People dominated by their own unconscious shadow often don't want emotional clarity. They want immediate relief from internal tensions that they themselves cannot even understand. Jung said that everything we don't consciously confront returns in the form of destiny. A person unable to deal with insecurity can transform any criticism into a personal attack. Someone who has never confronted their own fear of abandonment may create constant crises to test the love of others. Another person, deeply dominated by feelings of inferiority, may begin to emotionally control those around them just to feel some kind of psychological power. And the most dangerous thing is that these dynamics aren't always conscious. Many people genuinely believe they are simply reacting to the world in a legitimate way. They don't realize that their emotions have become instruments of control. Now consider something curious. The emotional manipulator almost never dominates through logic. They dominate through the emotional environment they create. And that completely changes the rules of the psychological game. When someone creates constant tension, the other person's mind enters a state of heightened vigilance. The brain begins to prioritize emotional survival over deep reflection. Jung observed that intense emotions have the ability to temporarily hijack rational consciousness. In other words, the greater the emotional chaos, the less capable one is of seeing the situation clearly. That's why emotionally manipulative people alternate between moments of tension, guilt, fragility, and affection. This alternation creates psychological confusion. One moment you feel exhausted, the next you feel hopeful, then guilt, then relief. The mind begins to live in constant instability. And you know what's most disturbing about all of this? A manipulator often doesn't need to win arguments. They just need to make you doubt yourself. Jung understood that psychological identity depends on a stable relationship with one's own perception of reality. When someone constantly questions your intentions, distorts your words, or turns any reaction of yours into a problem, a silent erosion begins to occur. You start mentally reviewing everything you've said. You begin to feel guilty for setting simple boundaries, and you slowly lose confidence in your own perception. This explains why so many emotionally conscious people end up exhausted in manipulative relationships. They're not just fighting against another person. They're fighting to maintain their own mental clarity. There is yet another detail that Jung considered fundamental. The less integrated someone's shadow is, the more that person projects their internal conflicts onto others. The individual dominated by repressed anger sees aggression in everyone. The person consumed by falsehood constantly accuses others of dishonesty. Those driven by envy often believe they are being persecuted or devalued. Psychological projection is one of the most invisible weapons of manipulation because it forces the victim to defend themselves against accusations that originated within the accuser themselves. And perhaps this is precisely where the real danger begins. Because, after a long time trying to stabilize another person's emotional chaos, something inside you slowly begins to change. Your energy diminishes, your clarity weakens, your intuition begins to grow silent, and when someone loses touch with their own intuition, it becomes much easier to accept false narratives as if they were true. There's a reason why some people can control entire environments without raising their voices. They've understood something Carl Jung considered one of the most primitive forces of the human mind: the fear of social exclusion. Humans can endure physical pain, financial losses, and even prolonged emotional suffering, but few things provoke as much fear as the feeling of being isolated by the group. And manipulators know this intuitively. Perhaps you've already experienced a situation like this. A conflict begins between two people, but suddenly strange phrases appear. Everyone notices that about you. People comment on your behavior. I'm not the only one who thinks that way. There are almost never names, evidence, or concrete facts, yet these phrases produce an immediate psychological effect. Doubt begins silently. Jung understood that our minds possess very ancient collective structures, what he called the collective unconscious. For thousands of years, being rejected by the group meant real danger. Survival depended on belonging, and even living in modern societies, part of the human brain still reacts to exclusion as if it were a physical threat. That's why social triangulation works so well. It doesn't try to prove you wrong. It tries to make you feel like you're alone. And when an intelligent person begins to feel socially isolated, something curious happens. Instead of reacting impulsively, they usually engage in self-analysis. They begin to review their own behavior. They try to figure out if they really failed at something. Meanwhile, the manipulator gains an emotional advantage without needing to demonstrate anything at all. Modern research on social pressure reveals something unsettling. In several psychological experiments, individuals were led to doubt even obvious visual information simply because a surrounding group held a different version of reality. In some classic tests of social conformity, participants even denied what they clearly saw with their own eyes, just to avoid disagreeing with the majority. Now imagine this mechanism at work within an intense emotional relationship. Jung believed that the human mind has a deep need for external validation when it loses touch with its own psychological center. And that is exactly what manipulative relationships slowly do. They erode a person's inner confidence until their perception constantly needs the approval of others to exist. But there is another, even more dangerous layer. Manipulators rarely control solely through direct accusations. Often, they control through narrative confusion. They distort conversations, alter contexts, reinterpret events, and retell stories in subtly modified ways. At first, they seem like just minor misunderstandings. Then they begin to happen with frightening frequency. You explain something clearly, but hours later, the other person acts as if you said something completely different. You try to correct, clarify, reorganize the conversation. But the problem never ends. The distortion returns again. Jung observed that human consciousness depends on symbolic stability to maintain psychological balance. When the surrounding reality becomes emotionally unstable and cognitively confusing, the mind begins to expend energy simply trying to organize basic perception. And the more energy someone uses trying to understand what is happening, the less energy is left to realize that they are being manipulated. Perhaps that's why so many people describe manipulative relationships as tiring, even when they can't exactly explain why. Psychological burnout rarely arrives dramatically. It comes slowly. Small, repeated arguments, endless explanations, circular conflicts that never resolve, criticism disguised as concern, seemingly small but constant emotional tensions. Jung believed that psychic energy functions like any other form of energy. It can be drained. And an emotionally drained person gradually loses their capacity for deep perception. This is perhaps one of the most frightening aspects of psychological manipulation. It doesn't first destroy your intelligence, it destroys your inner stability. Little by little, you stop trusting your own memory, your own intuition, and even your own emotions. And then something happens that Jung considered extremely dangerous. The person begins to look outside for what they previously found within themselves: clarity, security, validation, emotional direction. At that point, it becomes much easier to control. But there is an even more sophisticated mask that some people learn to use, a mask so powerful that it can transform emotional control into apparent moral virtue. And when that happens, manipulation ceases to seem like manipulation. It begins to look like ethical authority. There is a form of manipulation far more sophisticated than yelling, guilt, or emotional chaos. And precisely because it appears morally correct, it becomes extremely difficult to perceive. Carl Jung observed that the most dangerous masks of human personality rarely present themselves as something dark. They appear as virtue, conscience, sensitivity, and ethical superiority. This is the moment when the shadow stops acting through aggression and begins to act through morality. Perhaps you've met someone like this before. People who always seem to occupy the morally superior position in any situation. They never just disagree. They make the other person feel that disagreeing with them reveals some moral flaw. Any boundary you set becomes selfishness. Any reaction of yours becomes insensitivity. Any distancing becomes proof of emotional cruelty. And what's most unsettling is that these people often genuinely believe they are right. Jung called this identification with the persona. The persona is the social mask we construct to be accepted by the world. The problem begins when someone completely merges with this mask and comes to believe that it represents their true identity. The person ceases to see their own shadow because they are hypnotized by the moral image they have created of themselves. The less someone acknowledges their own darkness, the more dangerous that person can become. Because when an individual sincerely believes they are incapable of manipulation, selfishness, or cruelty, any destructive behavior automatically seems justifiable within their own mind. Jung understood this deeply. He said that no one becomes conscious by imagining figures of light, but by becoming aware of their own darkness. Without this internal confrontation, the shadow begins to act disguised as kindness, and perhaps that's precisely what makes certain people so difficult to identify. They don't control through explicit threats. They control through the constant feeling of moral inadequacy they produce in others. You start to feel like you need to justify your emotions all the time. Explain your limits. Defend your tiredness. Apologize for normal things. Gradually, the relationship stops functioning as a healthy emotional exchange and transforms into an invisible psychological tribunal where only one person seems to possess the moral authority to define what is right. Jung perceived something profoundly human in this. The desire to appear good can be more dangerous than the desire to appear powerful, because those who seek power usually know what they are doing. But those who are dominated by the unconscious need for moral superiority often believe they are fighting for the truth, when in reality they are only protecting their own ego. There is a disturbing curiosity about human nature. Great historical atrocities were rarely committed by people who saw themselves as villains. Most believed they were morally right. Jung was deeply disturbed to observe how seemingly ordinary people could justify destructive behavior when they identified with ideas of purity, superiority, or absolute virtue. This happens because the human ego loves to hide its shadow behind noble causes, and within personal relationships, this mechanism becomes extremely dangerous. When someone assumes the role of the moral conscience of the relationship, any resistance begins to seem like guilt. You are no longer just discussing opinions. You begin to feel that your own ethical identity is being constantly judged. Intelligent people suffer greatly in this type of dynamic because they usually have strong moral compasses. They don't want to be unfair, they don't want to hurt anyone, they don't want to act cruelly. And morally sophisticated manipulators exploit exactly that. Jung believed that guilt can function as a powerful tool of psychological control when disconnected from objective reality. Gradually, the person stops evaluating concrete facts and begins to react only to the constant fear of appearing morally inadequate. This is perhaps the most dangerous stage of manipulation, because at this point, control no longer depends on intense discussions or conflicts. The victim's own mind begins to work against them. The individual starts to monitor themselves all the time. They repress legitimate emotions. They question their own limits. They fear displeasing others. They fear appearing cold. They fear disappointing others. And then something profoundly ironic happens. The most ethical person in the relationship often becomes the most psychologically trapped. Jung saw this as one of the great tragedies of human unconsciousness. People who dedicate their entire lives to appearing good often never develop true self-awareness. And without awareness, the shadow continues to operate hidden behind what appears to be virtue. But Jung also believed that there is a way out of this psychological labyrinth. It just requires something that few people are truly willing to do, because recognizing manipulation by others is difficult. But recognizing that part of ourselves that allows us to be dominated by it can be even more painful. Carl Jung believed that the greatest human prison is not created by governments, money, or external circumstances. The greatest prison is born when a person loses touch with their own consciousness, when they can no longer distinguish what they truly feel from what they have been emotionally conditioned to feel. And perhaps that is exactly what manipulation does in a more silent way. It distances you from yourself. At first, it seems like just emotional exhaustion. Then comes the constant doubt. Next, the guilt. And then, almost without realizing it, you begin to abandon parts of your own identity to maintain stability in environments that were never truly stable. But Jung also believed in something profoundly hopeful. That which becomes conscious loses some of its power over us. This is the central point of everything we've seen so far. True protection against manipulation doesn't stem from emotional coldness. It doesn't stem from extreme distrust. It doesn't stem from becoming indifferent to people. It stems from clarity. Clarity about patterns. Clarity about emotions. Clarity about what happens inside you when someone tries to control your perception of reality. And this clarity needs to be translated into practice. The first step is to start observing patterns instead of isolated episodes. Manipulative people survive because they can convince others that each conflict was just an emotional accident. But patterns don't lie. If you constantly feel guilty, drained, confused, or emotionally unstable around someone, that's already enough information to be taken seriously. The second step is to regain control of psychological time. Jung understood that intense emotions reduce rational awareness. Therefore, manipulative people pressure for quick responses, immediate reactions, and emotional decisions. Learn to create pauses. Don't respond to everything instantly. Not every accusation requires an immediate defense. Not every tension requires an urgent solution. The third step is perhaps the most difficult. Stop trying to save people who don't want awareness. This is one of the most common traps among intelligent and emotionally empathetic individuals. There is a difference between helping someone and sacrificing yourself by trying to carry internal conflicts that belong to the other person. Jung believed that no one transforms another person by force. True change only happens when there is an inner willingness to see one's own shadow. The fourth step is to rebuild confidence in your own perception. Psychological manipulation slowly destroys a person's relationship with their own intuition. You begin to doubt what you feel, perceive, and observe. Therefore, pay attention again to the sensations that arise within you during certain interactions. Your body often perceives tension long before your mind accepts the truth. And there's something important here. Clarity doesn't mean the absence of pain. Often, seeing reality clearly hurts more than remaining trapped in illusion. Jung knew this. The individuation process, the path to becoming self-aware, almost always requires letting go of old fantasies about people, relationships, and even ourselves. But there is freedom in that. Because when you learn to see patterns without running away from them, something profoundly changes within your mind. You stop needing constant approval from others to validate what you perceive. You stop negotiating your boundaries to avoid guilt. You stop confusing empathy with emotional submission. And then a silent force emerges that Jung considered one of the greatest possible psychological achievements: inner sovereignty. The ability to feel without being overwhelmed by the emotions of others. The ability to listen without absorbing all of another's pain as your own responsibility. The ability to remain human without allowing your humanity to be used against you. Perhaps this is the true meaning of psychological maturity: not becoming cold, not becoming distant, but learning to remain conscious even within the emotional chaos created by other people. Because in the end, the most difficult person to manipulate isn't the most aggressive. It's not the most intelligent. It's not the coldest. She is the one who has learned to see herself honestly. If this video made you reflect on relationships, emotional patterns, or experiences you've lived through, write in the comments. If you prefer, do so anonymously. Many people may recognize themselves in your story and notice signs they couldn't see before. And if you want more in-depth content about Carl Jung, psychology, emotional manipulation, and human consciousness, subscribe to the channel and like the video. This helps this content reach people who may be silently experiencing exactly this type of psychological conflict.